I've been told that it's even snowing a little bit since I got here, so you're a hardy bunch. Thanks for being here. I don't have a detailed introduction. I just want to say that we're very, very lucky to have Jim Merrill here with us tonight. Taught at Vassar for many years, retired just what, a couple years ago?
A couple years ago.
A couple years ago. Written many books about early America, 18th century America. Won a number of awards that, if you're a historian, this is the kind of thing that you care about. And so he's going to talk today about kind of the interactions between native population, settlers, 18th century Dutchess County. He'll have time for questions at the end if people...
If they can last that long.
Okay. And there's cookies at the end as well. And at the end, I'll give you a little preview of next month's program as well. So I'll turn it over to Jim Merrill. All right. Thanks for being here.
When I backed out of the driveway, I live over near Vassar. I saw it was snowing. I thought, hey, there's going to be 3 people here tonight. Me and Robert, maybe Allison, and a couple others keep the door open. So I'm somewhat overwhelmed. If I'd known this many people were coming, I would have prepared something. No, I've got something. Don't worry. Thanks, Robert, for the introduction, and thanks to you and Allison for doing all the work that is required to get me here. You know, the logistics of travel from Poughkeepsie to here are just enormous. Flights and trains and all that. I want to thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful winter night. I was born and raised in Minnesota, so I'm used to the cold and the snow. I used to tell people, you know what they call a day like today and where I grew up? May. And it's actually not like that, but I think my blood has thinned after all these years in Hudson Valley, and I'm ready for winter to be over. Thanks very much. Speaking of thanks, I'd like to thank my puppy Cody for not eating this talk, because about 4 o'clock this afternoon he was kind of getting out of control, so I thought I'll calm him down and sit on the floor with him. And while I'm sitting on the floor and he's napping in my lap, I will then, I'll go through the talk once more. And he didn't settle down. He went for the talk too and tried to eat it. So I did get it out of his hands, and I'm grateful to him for not being as quick as I was. I never asked Robert how long he wanted me to speak. And I should have told him that after 40 years of teaching at Vassar, there were really 2 class times that I taught, 75 minutes and 2 hours. So which would you like tonight? I can stretch it as much as you want. I'm going to talk for less than either of those. The other thing I want to say is if you can't hear me, please tell me. Raise your hand and say, speak louder. I once gave a talk, and at the end of this talk, which I thought I was superb that night, somebody came up to me and said, I only heard 5/8 of what you said. I don't know how he came up with 5/8, this person, but if you're only hearing 5/8 of what I'm saying tonight, please do let me know, and I'll try and talk a little bit louder. I was last in this library almost a year ago when I invited myself to the Millbrook Historical Society in search of an 18th century map of these parts. I'd read about it in a 1940 article in the Dutchess Historical Society yearbook in which they mentioned this map of early 9 partners in the possession of Miss Catherine Waddell and her father Silas Waddell. So I invited myself to the Historical Society, and Robert and Allison were very generous in making time for me, welcoming me to the village hall just down the street here, and they gave me a tour of the Society's holdings in the basement there. I felt like a kid in a candy store. I was just looking around from one place to the other. We did not find that elusive map, but I came away with a deeper knowledge of the early history of Millbrook and vicinity. After I left the village hall, my wife Linda and I met up to wander the wonderful streets of Millbrook for a little while, and we ended up here in the library. I remember thinking as we walked through the library and looked around, this is what a local library should look like. This is what it should be. It really is a beautiful spot, and it reminds me a little bit of the library in St. Paul, where I grew up. My first library, where I got my first library card, which was one of the last Carnegie libraries built about 100 years ago. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to share with you a story I've been working on for far too long, which is about Wappinger Indians and their neighbors, tenant farmers, just before the American Revolution. The year 1766 forms the heart of this tale, but as you'll see, there's more to it than that. Understanding the unlikely course of human events here in 1766, which included a firefight between local farmers and British troops near Pauling, a show trial of those traitors and rebels that was held in Poughkeepsie, a Wappinger sachem's audience with King George III. Understanding all of those events requires going farther back in time. I wonder, what do you know about that particular chapter in Dutchess County's history? Does the name Daniel Nimham mean anything to people here? Does the name William Prendergast, my hittable wing, his spouse? Do these things mean, is this out there that you know something?
We're the Pauling Historical Society.
Well, okay. These are not plans. It's a plan. Have you gotten the signage up for the new historical marker? I gather that near Patterson, they took it down, the scene of the firefight with the British, because it was incorrect. It had it happening in 1776, and it happened, the wrong people were fighting. So these are events that are somewhat known locally, but not very well known, not as well known as I think they should be. And that's what has drawn me to them. As I say, I'm glad to have a chance to share with you some of what I found out about this neck of the American woods long ago, even if doing so exposes, I confess, how lost in those woods I still am. In fact, I feel like a fellow named Henry Beekman, one of the great Hudson Valley landlords, a name you know, Beekman, when in 1743, some Poughkeepsie men asked for his help sorting out their land affairs. Okay, Beekman replied, but he went on, I only wish I had more experience and ability. This business is so confused that it takes a better head than mine to disentangle the matter and bring it to clearness. When I read that sentence, I thought, boy, I feel you, Henry Beekman. I too can say when it comes to the land battles of his time, the business is indeed confused. The matter is entangled. And I sometimes think it will take a better head than mine to bring it to clearness. But here I am, here you are, let me give it a try. One thing I learned early on, is that the colonial period of this area's history is hard to explore because the surviving sources are, especially when you sit beside the loudmouths down in New York City who are squabbling from the very first and writing up their squabbles, or our scribbling New England neighbors to the east, the sources are pretty scarce. There aren't a lot of surviving diaries and letters from the mid-Hudson Valley from those early years. So the locals weren't writing much, and outsiders didn't write a lot. The Wappinger Indians did not interest the powers that were in New York City. They were focused very much on the Six Nations Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy located up north and west of here. That's where they had all the treaties, that's where they were writing all the letters and accepting and sending ambassadors. For colonists in these parts, one explanation for the dearth of documents written by visitors is less geography than topography. As you might have noticed, certainly coming to Vassar from my prairie state of Minnesota long ago, I've noticed the terrain around here is a little bit hilly. Imagine trying to get from here to there in the Hudson Valley in the days before cars, before hills could get dynamited and roads paved. Small wonder that people then often went between Albany and New York City by sloop, sailing right on past Poughkeepsie and Dutchess County. Hence the traveler accounts that I've relied on and historians generally rely on to eliminate many shadowy corners of early America are largely missing for this neighborhood. Wayfarers might write about what they saw from the ship's deck as they sailed up and down the Hudson. A common refrain that I found in these travel accounts was, it sure is hilly and wooded around here, and then they would go. But too few came ashore to have a look around and then wrote about their experiences. But there was a time when Dutchess County was famous, or, depending on your point of view, infamous. That was in 1766, some 259 years ago. In that year, as I mentioned, local tenant farmers, angry about mistreatment by the big landlords, Beekmans, Livingstons, the Phillipses to the south in what is now Putnam County, but was then southern Dutchess, these farmers took matters into their own hands, which culminated in that battle with British troops and that treason trial of William Prendergast of Pauling, the tenant's alleged ringleader, in our county seat of Poughkeepsie. These doings got the attention of newspapers as far away as Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, Virginia. Meanwhile, even farther afield, people in London that same summer of 1766 were also hearing about this area, because an Indian delegation, including the Wappinger leader Daniel Nimham, arrived in the imperial capital to complain about those same landlords, who, the native emissaries insisted, have stolen our homeland. And no wonder people were fascinated. There was drama aplenty on both of these stages. At that packed courtroom in Poughkeepsie during Prendergast's trial, it was said his best weapon was his wife Mehitable, who left 5 children behind, including an infant, to travel to Poughkeepsie from Pauling to defend her spouse. Poised, determined, as the evidence opened against William, a newspaper reported, she never failed to make every remark that might put his conduct in the most favorable point of view. So effective an advocate was Mehitable during the trial that some officials, afraid that she swayed the passions of the jury, wanted her banished from the courtroom. She stayed, but despite her efforts, the jury convicted Prendergast of treason, and the judges sentenced him to a traitor's death, which was read aloud that day in the courtroom to terrify all who heard it with the king's justice. Here's what William Prendergast heard. The prisoner shall be hanged by the neck, and then shall be cut down alive, and his entrails and privy members shall be cut from his body. Let's pause and contemplate this for a minute. No, maybe not. You might have just eaten. His privy members and entrails shall be cut from his body, and shall be burned in his sight. And his head shall be cut off, presumably by now he's dead, and his body shall be divided into 4 parts, and shall be disposed of at the king's pleasure. Hearing the verdict and the punishment that awaited him, the doomed man, according to one who was there, uttered an ejaculatory prayer to God for mercy, then collapsed like a slaughtered ox. Now, I've never seen a slaughtered ox. I don't know if any of you have. But ox roasts were very common in colonial times, so that phrase would have meant a lot to people who read this account. Sighs and groans arose from every corner of the house, recalled another witness, and the whole audience were melted into tears. Well, if Mehitable wept too, she soon enough dried her eyes, for according to one story told at the time, she headed directly to the provincial capital, then New York City, to ask that the governor recommend the king pardon her husband. See what I mean about drama? A historian in 1940 called this tale one of the most interesting episodes in all of American colonial history. So interesting indeed, he insisted, that it deserves a fascinating full-length novel. I think it deserves a movie. And perhaps after I finish my talk, we can cast it. I got to tell you that if they were 40 years younger, a couple of locals would be perfect for William and Mehitable. Liam Neeson for William Prendergast, who was probably about 37 years old when these events happened, and Merrill Streep, Vassar alum, for Mehitable Wing. This would be great. So we got to think of somebody a generation younger than Miss Streep and Mr. Neeson. I want you to think about that. But the Dutchess County courtroom wasn't the only stage. In England, Daniel Nimham and the rest were feted by the ladies of Southampton when they disembarked there on July 29, 1766, and they found many more admirers as they made their way overland to London. In the imperial capital for several weeks, they met with crown officials like Lord Shelburne, none other than Lord Shelburne, His Majesty's Secretary of State, and with none other than the King himself. The story of what paths led Prendergast, Nimham, and the rest to the county courthouse here, or the corridors of British power across the Atlantic in 1766, is longer and more complicated than I can share with you tonight. And truth to tell, it's longer and more complicated than I've been able to figure out. But I can say that the farmers' unrest and the Wappingers' unhappiness were both simmering for some time before they came to a boil that year. Starting back in the fall of 1763, modestly calling themselves wholesome inhabitants, tenant farmers began petitioning crown officials. We farm land that the king never granted anyone, they announced. Worse, Beekmans and Phillipses, especially a man named Beverly Robinson, a Virginia-born gentleman, friend of George Washington, who'd married into the Phillips family, these people not only claim this land, but they're demanding intolerable leases from us. If we refuse to pay, Robinson takes us to court and then has the sheriff throw us off farms we have worked for decades. 2 years later, those pleas unanswered, those petitions unheard, the evictions continuing, these folks had had enough. In November 1765, men posted signs at Samuel Towner's Tavern and other places in what was then southern Dutchess. There's still a hamlet called Towner's just over the county line in Putnam, in fact. These advertisements, as they called them, invited all persons having regard to the evicted tenants to assemble together to do justice to them. Hundreds of angry men gathered in what is now Patterson, just south of Pauling, determined to restore the people turned out of possession of their farms. And somehow, amid all the confusion and what one person called shouts and tumultuous noise, William Prendergast became the leader of the so-called mob men. Then these mob men set to work, fanning out across the countryside to oust those farmers the landlords and sheriff had put in. Try for a minute to imagine that you are living in Dutchess County then, and you are among their targets. It's the late fall of 1765. Winter is nigh. As one victim put it, it's the dark of the evening. Your kids, maybe your spouse, perhaps even you, are asleep. Suddenly a gang of men is in your house. Maybe they broke the door down. Maybe they drew the latch and crept in, as one reported. One guy woke to find a man with a club standing beside his bed, telling him to get up and get outside to face 200 people who were unhappy. They ordered you and yours into the cold night. As you stumble out, these intruders settle one of their own into your house, your hearth, your bed. This very thing happened to a fellow named James Covey Jr. 40 men came to my door, Covey reported, barged in, threw my wife and me into the darkness, and had somebody else move right in. Who was the lucky guy to get James Covey Jr.'s farm? James Covey Sr. I really wish I'd been at the family reunion of the Coveys. Dad, how's my farm doing? We don't know more than that, just that it was James Covey Sr. Things cool off after that initial ousting in November of 1765. They cooled off over the winter, as things are wont to do around here, just look outside. But come spring, these mob men were back in action. In April 1766, Prendergast led hundreds of men south to New York City, threatening that if Governor Henry Moore didn't listen to their grievances, they'd burn the place down. This was no idle threat. 10 years later, a fire consumed about a third of New York City. Governor Moore's response was to put a bounty on the heads of Prendergast and other leaders, muster the militia, and have British troops who were stationed there in New York City put on high alert. Stymied, these mob men were not stupid. Back this way the mob men came, but they were not done. In late May, they dragged an unlucky justice of the peace named Samuel Peters off his horse, hauled him to a makeshift cell in the back room of Towner's Tavern, and then put him out on trial in a rough outdoor courtroom, the Honorable William Prendergast presiding. In early June, hundreds made their way to Poughkeepsie to spring one of their own from jail. He'd been thrown in jail for not paying his landlord. That was enough for the authorities. They brought in the army. At the end of that June, 375 redcoats landed at the Poughkeepsie docks and marched down the road in the opposite direction, looking for that pack of rebels. These were hard-bitten soldiers who had been fighting in Canada, they had been fighting in the Caribbean, they were heading south from Canada, and they were detoured. They were sailing down the Hudson in several of those sloops. They were going to New York City, and they were diverted to take care of this problem in Dutchess County. Before they left the county seat, their commanding officer, Major Arthur Brown, was confident. He looked around Poughkeepsie, he looked at the locals and their view of the troops at his command, all 300 plus of them. By the countenance of the inhabitants here, he wrote to his superior officers serenely, I am inclined to think the mere appearance of the regiment will sufficiently frighten that set of miserable, hardened wretches out by Pauling, who are raising hell in the eastern part of the county, and will persuade them to submit. All we have to do is show up, and they'll surrender. They don't have a chance against the might of the British Empire brought to bear. Like many an imperial officer, in a faraway place. Since then, Major Brown was too confident. Frightened, ready to submit, the mob men were awaiting them. They had their guns. When troops and tenants collided, the British took casualties, but they also took some 60 of the rioters and scattered the rest. Reports on what that day was like vary widely. The county sheriff, who was with the troops, happily reported to the governor, "The soldiers have not plundered, not so much as a chicken." The locals sang a different story, sang a different tune. The redcoats, they said, drove out the people, burned and destroyed some of their houses, pillaged and plundered others, stove their cider barrels, ripped open their feather beds, turned their provisions out into the open streets, and laid open their meadows and fields of grain before heading back to Poughkeepsie with their prisoners. I don't know which one is true. Did they just come in and say, oh, we're not going to bother you at all, and we're going to take these guys back to Poughkeepsie? Or did they come in and do what people at the time said they had done? All of the investigations and trials that followed bequeathed to us a trove of documents, making 1766 in Dutchess County something like a lightning flash that briefly illuminates a dark landscape. These sources, for once, let us hear the voices of obscure county folks loud and clear across 250 years, none more than their spokesman, William Prendergast. Some of what he had to say has a powerful eloquence. Asked how he came to lead this trouble, Prendergast replied, "I do it for the good of the country, for I pity the poor people who were turned out of their possessions." "Why not?" somebody said. "Use the law to defend your rights." Because, Prendergast said, there is no law for poor men. He also rejected the epithet mob, so often used then and since to describe him and his followers. You got to admit, mob is a powerful term. If you called me one night and said, "Jim, there's a crowd outside your door," I might open the front door and say, "Hey, what's going on out there?" If you called me and said, "Jim, there's a mob outside your door," I would probably call 911 before I opened the door. Mob has a real connotation of dangerous, violent, out of control. "You call us the mob," Prendergast told one British official, "but we call ourselves the Sons of Liberty." He's linking his men with the American resistance to British tax policies that in 1765 arose in Boston, New York, and other cities. And like Sam Adams up in Boston and the other Sons of Liberty, Prendergast proclaimed his loyalty to King George III. Asked by what authority he acted, he replied, "The King's." Warned that he was breaking the King's peace, he countered, "I am as good a subject to the King as you are." Well, for all that high-flown language, there was no hiding the anger. The times when, as one witness put it, Prendergast spoke very ugly. "I'm as good a subject to the King as you" came shortly after he'd warned darkly that kings had been brought low by mobs before now. And the King's officials in the county heard even more abuse from him. "Damned rascal," he shouted at one, "damned son of a bitch." Pronouncing sentence on Justice Peters that day, in that outdoor courtroom down by Patterson, Prendergast told Peters what the Crown's law had in store for any person who offended us. It's a little bit like the punishment that was read out to Prendergast a couple of months later. Any person who broke our law, we would take him to the first convenient place of mud and water, and there duck him as long as we think proper. And from thence we would take him to a white oak tree, and there whip him for as long as we think proper. And then take him out of the county, and there kick his ass for as long as we think proper. At which point all the crowd said, "Huzzah! Let us go!" Prendergast wasn't the only one we can hear speaking his mind in these documents that came out later. That spring of 1766, rumors that British troops might invade Dutchess County to stop them provoked a chorus of what we might call trash talk. "Redcoats are coming? Good. Let them come," snarled one man. "We will soon dispatch them. We'll kill them all," vowed another. "It'll be good sport," boasted a third, and yet another spoke for so many when he wished them all in hell. So, in 1766, the mob men, convinced, as one put it, poor men are always oppressed by the rich, determined to see justice done, went on the proverbial warpath. What about Daniel Nimham and those Wappingers? They didn't. No threats, idle or otherwise. No trash talk. No mass marches on the Capitol. No clubs, no guns. Instead, led by Nimham, natives chose a different path, one that brought them into colonial courtrooms and provincial council chambers before taking them to London in their quest to get their lands back from Beverly Robinson and the other members of the Phillips clan. Nimham's campaign began around the same time as the tenant farmers, the early 1760s. In 1761, he stopped by Katarina Brett's house in Beacon. The house is still there. I don't know if any of you have been there. Madam Brett was a remarkable person. She owned a vast tract of Dutchess County and had been living down by Fishkill and Beacon since 1709. And she would have known Daniel all of his life. Daniel was there that day to talk about his land rights and to ask Brett whether she was fulfilling her obligations to him and his family. She knew that family well, and for decades. She called Daniel's grandfather, Old Nimham, not only a friend of mine, said Madam Brett, but as honest and moral a creature as ever I knew. You don't hear colonists saying this about Native Americans very often in the 18th century. As honest and moral a creature as ever I knew. The summer after that 1761 meeting with Brett, Daniel got word that no less than the great Sir William Johnson, the Crown Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern Department, this was the king's man for all of the native peoples north of about Virginia, all the way up into what is now Canada. Soon I gather to be our 51st state, so we want to pay attention to Canada. I wanted to get that in there. He heard that William Johnson was passing through Dutchess County. I don't know how he heard it, but he found out where he was. And around about where, at a house near where Route 9 and Interstate 84 intersect, he found Johnson and spent time with Johnson, registering his people's complaints. A week or two after that, Nimham was in New York City, giving a history of Wappinger land affairs to none other than the colony's Attorney General. Meanwhile, Nimham somehow coaxed a letter of recommendation from a Massachusetts minister. We have that letter. To whomever it concerns, the reference goes, Daniel Nimham appears to me to be an intelligent man of good natural abilities considerably improved by English education, and he is addicted to no vice that I know of. Okay, it's not the warmest letter of recommendation that I've ever read. It appears to me to be intelligent. He's not addicted to any vice that I know of. Not the best letter of recommendation. Some of you have written a number of these letters of recommendation over the years, and you know what I mean. But still, it's a letter of recommendation from a Massachusetts minister. Madam Brett and Sir William, New England clergyman and New York's chief law officer. What is the Wappinger up to in the early 1760s? He's stockpiling weapons. Thus armed, Nimham went to work. In 1764, he and other Wappinger leaders, claiming they were unskilled in English learning, made their legal guardian one Samuel Monroe, a particularly feisty farmer who had been fighting Beverly Robinson as he had fought Henry Beekman 20 years earlier. Then Monroe and Nimham went around posting announcements saying that this land still belongs to the Indians. Want to keep your farm? Come to Daniel Nimham and get a lease from him. The Robinson lease won't hold. The Phillips lease won't hold. Colonists did just that, one after another of them. So many, in fact, that to make things more efficient, somebody actually printed up blank lease forms with Nimham's name on them so they could just fill in the names and the acreage and the location and move and what the rent is and move it along. Talk about land office business. Then it was time in early 1765 for Nimham to head downriver, not with a mob, but with Monroe and a few other Indians, not to burn down the city, but to convince the governor and council in a formal hearing that neither a Phillips nor anyone else had ever bought Wappinger country. The deck was stacked against them. For one thing, no New York lawyer would take their case, because helping Indians would end his legal career. For another, most of those at the hearing were either landlords themselves or their kin and friends. It was, as one account put it, not a fair trial. The provincial council and various attorneys tried to baffle, terrify, browbeat, and affrighten the Indians, warning them that if you pushed your claim, you might be immediately committed to jail. Then Robinson got into the act. Of course, Beverly Robinson was sitting there with the council, even though he wasn't on the council. He got into the act with his lawyers. He whipped out of his pocket what he claimed was a 1702 deed that sold all of the Wappingers' land to one Adolph Phillips. When Monroe asked for a look at this remarkable document, nobody had heard of this or seen it for 63 years, allegedly, since it had been supposedly signed, sealed, and delivered. He had scarcely gotten a hold of it and started to look at it with Nimham over his shoulder when an official snatched it back, turned to the natives, and told them, "You'd best go home about your business." They went home all right, but their business was to keep fighting. For this next phase of the contest, Nimham had lost his ally, Samuel Monroe. Poor Monroe. He got thrown into jail before he even left New York City. Ostensibly for stirring up the Indians, as they put it, but actually, as his foes wrote, for contentious and over-busy meddling with other men's affairs, and being undoubtedly a very bad man. Okay, we got something on him, we'll get something on him later. Right now he's a jerk, we don't like him, he's causing trouble, throw him in jail. I'm sure they were sorry to see Monroe go, but they were unfazed. They hired some Connecticut lawyers, a couple of Yale grads, who were more than happy to fight New York lawyers, and continued to press their case. In the summer of 1765, he and his allies visited Sir William Johnson at the Crown Superintendent's headquarters up beyond Albany, another house that still stands up in Johnstown, asking for his help in going over the heads of New York officials, because Johnson doesn't have anything to do with New York officials. He only reports to the king and his ministers in London. Can we get your help in sailing to London ourselves? It took a year, but they made it to England. And on leaving London in October 1766, they got what they wanted. A letter to New York's governor from the Secretary of State Shelburne, ordering in the king's name and in the strongest manner that New York hold a fair hearing on the Wappingers' claims. That same autumn, too, in fact, the same day, October 11, 1766, Shelburne also wrote a document that gave William Prendergast what he and Mahitable wanted, a royal pardon. By year's end, William was a free man, and Nimham was back home, rounding up witnesses who would testify, colonists who would testify to his people's land title. It was all in vain. There was a second hearing in March 1767. It had the same result. Wappingers lost again, and were told again, go home. The irony, of course, is that they now had no home to go to. The end? You're thinking, kind of short, but okay. Glancing at your watches, you're thinking, what's on TV tonight? What starts at 8 o'clock, or maybe even 7:30? I think there's a Knicks game on. Not so fast. I have a confession to make. I've been misleading you tonight in a number of ways. And I hope you'll indulge me a while longer to count 4 of those ways, because it gets at some of the larger meaning that I see in this story. First, this is one story, not 2. I've told it tonight as 2. As have scholars before me. The scholarship is, they look at the tenant rioters, or they look at the Wappingers land case. They don't look at them together. They belong together. Yes, in August 1766, Prendergast and Nimham were on an ocean apart. One was in a county jail cell, awaiting the king's pardon. One sat in London, awaiting the king's presence. And yes, Beverly Robinson in 1766 wrote of the Indian and mob affairs, plural, as if he were waging 2 different wars. But he wasn't. It's a single war, a single tale. Robinson himself makes this one story. Both tenants and Wappingers knew he was their most formidable foe among the landlords. Not only that, but the territory they quarreled over, tenant farmers, Robinson and the Phillips clan, and the Native Americans, it's all the very same land, mostly what is now Putnam County. And not only that, but colonial farmers, fed up with the largeness of rents and shortness of leases, as one of the farmers put it, that Beekman's and Phillips's offered, were only too happy to have Indians as their landlords. As I just mentioned, they were signing all of these leases with Daniel Nimham. One colonist after another, sitting down and signing up with Nimham. At the end of that year, in 1764, during a very heavy snowstorm. They said it was the heaviest snow. They had to shut down the courts because it was so cold and there was so much snow. People couldn't even make it to court. Nonetheless, 30-some men gathered somewhere we don't know in southern Dutchess County. Their foes called them Nimham and crew. Daniel Nimham and about 33 colonists. They got together and they made their resistance and their alliance official. They drew up and put their names to the Articles of Combination, to elect leaders, to raise money, and to plot strategy for helping the Indians get their land, thereby helping themselves. So that's one way I've been holding out on you tonight. I haven't yet figured out how to weave these two stories into one tale, but I'm working on it and I'm getting there. Another way I've been holding out is that the roots of 1766 actually go back not a few years, as I've been suggesting, more like decades. Take, for example, those 1764 secret meetings of Nimham and crew and all those leases. Think about that for a minute. Consider the familiarity between local natives and local colonists, the trust in one another across their cultural divide that was necessary to hatch their schemes, risk arrest, scratch out those leases and other agreements in this farmhouse or that tavern to court trouble. That trust doesn't happen overnight. It rested, I argue, on ordinary encounters stretching to the beginning of the 18th century. The problem with going that far back is the lack of records I mentioned earlier. Natives were so ubiquitous in Dutchess County, so much a part of the social landscape of the neighborhood. The colonists, thinking them literally unremarkable, wrote precious little about them. We know, for instance, as I've said, that Nimhams lived near Katharina Brett from her arrival in 1709 until her death in 1764. We also know that in 1767, an elderly judge and Dutchess County leader named Jacobus Turbos happened to mention, in the course of talking about other things, oh sure, I speak Wappinger. I'm well acquainted with them because I've lived near them, indeed, you could say among them, for decades now. Did Turbos or Brett pause late in life to write about all of that, to pen a memoir entitled, oh, I don't know, the guy can dream, My Life Among the Wappinger Indians? No. None of you have it in your attic or anything, do you? Let me know if you do. Did Brett sit down with the Nimhams she knew, not just Daniel, but Daniel's parents and Daniel's grandparents, and take down their stories? No. They never wrote a thing that has survived, because they were busy, no doubt, but also because to them, such a lifetime of interactions with native peoples was, as I say, unremarkable, not worthy of remark. Still, if you look at the documents that do survive, you catch tantalizing glimpses of a shadowy world we have not only lost, but also forgotten. Even late in the colonial period, even here in the Hudson Valley, which had been colonized for 2 generations or more, contacts were happening on a daily basis. Contacts that had prepared them in the 1760s to fight together the powers there were. I want to take a look at some of these interactions, just at what I found for this part of the county, which was then called Filkentown. Wow, who knows Filkentown? The rest of you know Filkentown? No reason you would. Filkentown was named for Henry Filken, who was the son of one of the original 9 partners. And Henry II, Henry Jr., himself was a local big shot around here and in the county. In the 1740s, he was county sheriff. In the 1750s, he twice got elected from Dutchess County to the New York Assembly. Where was Filkentown, you ask? Good question. I don't know. That's why I was looking for that map that we're still trying to find. Some say it was Mabbittsville, out there on 44. Others say Washington Hollow. And some say the town is actually a misnomer, that it was more an area that included both of those places. Wherever Filkentown was exactly, it was somewhere around here. And so were 3 native villages within a day's travel. Chicomico up by Pine Plains, Weckquanak over by Sharon, and Scatticoke by Kent, just across the border. In addition, throughout the county, there were countless other smaller Indian places, as colonists called them, who were scattered about. In 1751, for example, when colonists wanted to speak with a Mohican man and his wife, he went to Filkentown and to Henry Filken to ask their whereabouts. And everybody said, oh yeah, they're living just to go down here and turn left. Who knows what directions they got. But everybody knew where this native family was living, in that particular Indian place. And that family was hardly alone. Consider, in June 1745, a Mohican man from Chicago spends an entire day at a nearby tavern. That's not an Indian tavern, that's a colonial tavern where he's drinking with his colonial neighbors. Throughout the 1750s, near Dover, natives are helping a colonial farmer harvest his crops. And at least once, they stayed over and danced through the entire night. In April 1756, groups of 6 or more Indian men, women, and children, some of them riding in a cart, passed through Filkentown. A couple of months later in 1756, several native peddlers visit Filkentown to sell their brooms, wooden utensils, and baskets to local colonists. And speaking of shopping, Daniel Nimham himself visited a store near Pauling run by one Malcolm Morrison. Nimham bought on credit, and Morrison kept accounts in his Indian book. Think about that. Why would he keep a separate book for Indian accounts if Nimham was his only Indian customer? He must have had so many customers that he had one set for colonists and one set for natives. I haven't found the book, but we know it was there because what happened? When Nimham didn't pay, Malcolm Morrison took him to court in Poughkeepsie and sued him for debt. And Nimham had been there because he, too, was suing colonists for land for money that he had lent to them. Not only that, but Nimham hired lawyers. One a local Poughkeepsie lawyer, another a lawyer from New York City to argue his case before the bench and bar in Poughkeepsie to get his money back. Think about all the contact that you had to have for these little traces to appear on the surface. All of the deals that had to be made, all of the, hey, where's my money? Oh, I don't have it yet. All of these kinds of conversations. And not least in terms of building relationships. Long before colonists got those printed leases from Nimham in 1764, Wappingers were renting land to these newcomers. James Phillips, no relation to the Phillips landlords, James Phillips was one. Making his way here in 1738, Phillips figured he'd simply not pay any regard to the Indians who were living nearby, and he'd just move right in when he found some land that he liked. But, as he remembered, I soon found myself to be under a mistake. I love that. I soon found myself to be under a mistake. I'm trying to imagine a scene where he found out he was under a mistake. The natives obviously paid him a visit. So he made a deal with them. And they went and marked me out a farm. You have to imagine natives surveying. They actually blazed the trees. They probably weren't surveying, but they're marking him out a farm, and he's going to rent from them. After that, Phillips concluded contentedly, I've lived peacefully and quietly under them for 30 years. And Phillips was just one of many colonists who, as they put it, bought their peace from Wappingers by setting up lease agreements. But for every person who found peace and quiet in these parts, many others discovered that lands and rents were nothing but trouble. And that's another lesson learned by going farther back into the Hudson Valley's past. Decades before Prendergast, Monroe, Nimham, and Robinson, it seems like everyone here was wrangling over property. Now, I'm sure that no longer happens today, that people don't have property disputes or boundary disputes or who owns what. This is past. These are in the dark ages of the 18th century. But back then, the court records are filled with fights. Endless battles over boundary lines. Knocking down a guy's fences to run your road through it. Cutting down trees that marked boundaries. You cut down all the trees and, well, who knows where the actual boundaries. I know of at least 2 attacks with axes between contending parties over whose land was whose. The documents are littered with land fights, large and small, between colonists, but also between colonists and Indians. As early as 1721, Katarina Brett complained that some mischievous white people are drawing up short-term leases with Wappingers for little bits of land. And then after the Wappingers sign off on it, they put in what quantity of land they please, knowing the Wappingers can't read, and make their leases not for 9 years or 9 months, but 99 years. In the mid-1730s, none other than Henry Beekman, in a private memo, really to himself, that I discovered in some archives in Princeton, vented his spleen, not at conniving colonists, but at Wappingers. I think this memo to himself There's a shopping list on the other side of things he wanted to buy. I don't know why he wrote this memo. I think it was one of those, you know how you write an email that you just want to blow off some steam, and you write an email, and then if you're lucky you don't hit send because you really didn't mean to send it? I write those emails fairly often. I never put the address in the top just in case I hit send accidentally because you can't get it back. I think this is what Beekman was doing. He had just come back from a surveying expedition with Nimham and colonists to find out the boundaries of his land, and something happened, and he was steamed. Mr. Nimham, he derisively called Daniel's predecessor. This is the very leader that Madame Brett had called an honest, moral man and a friend. What use is it to buy land of the Indians? Beekman fumed. For if we buy, you will still claim it forever, and then you try and sell it to us again. You are a conquered people, he insisted. Our forefathers indulged you when you were mere brutes, and you still grow worse. Your boasting threats, he snarled, must be stopped. You grow too insolent. Well, that Mr. Nimham had his own views on who had been kinder to whom back in the day. 10 years later, in 1745, at a New York City Treaty Council with the governor, he said this: "We Wappingers have been friends with the Christians when we were great and you were small." In other words, when you first arrived and were few. "So we expect that now we are become a small body, you will still esteem us. And by the way," he went on, "we're not cheating on lands. We're being cheated. Some colonists buy a small parcel of land from us and then take a large quantity," echoes of what Brett was saying 20 years before. "And others come and settle very thick on land which we never have sold. We hope," Nimham concluded, sounding a lot like those mob men 20 years later, "we hope to see justice done." When I say that it seems like everyone got into the Dutchess County land rush, I mean everyone. In 1755, Brett and other irate colonists even claimed that an enslaved African American named Jack, a crafty and subtle fellow they called him, was getting Indians drunk so they would sign away their lands to him and his accomplices. Once again, we get this scrap of information which brings out worlds of meaning. Here you have an African American enslaved man and his accomplices, whoever they were, sitting together with Wappingers and getting them drunk. Maybe he was trying to trick them and get them to sign over their lands to him. We don't know. All we know is that Madame Brett heard about this and was very unhappy. Soon after that 1755 episode, when Daniel Nimham and other Wappinger men, recruited by Sir William Johnson, left these parts to fight for King George II against the French. This is the so-called French and Indian War. I hate that title. It's wrong. Wappingers, Stockbridge, many other native, Catawbas and Cherokees from the south, many other native peoples fought on the side of the British against that, and yet because Native Americans always have to be on the other side, we call it the French and Indian War. Anyway, that's a digression, sorry. When Nimham and the Wappingers, they responded to a man to fight for King George II. Off they went, but first they stopped in Stockbridge, where the mission town of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where their kinfolk and friends lived, and they left their wives, their children, and their elderly there for protection because they didn't feel they'd be safe in Dutchess County. While they were away, another crafty and subtle fellow, Beverly Robinson, launched his campaign to settle things once and for all, taking advantage of the Indians' absence to pounce on the lands and set in motion the chain of events that ended with Nimham in London and Prendergast in prison. But we need to see that Robinson's scheme was just the latest chapter in a long history of land wars going way back in time. Just as territorial quarrels were common long before the crisis of the 1760s, so were mob men. Constant groups are getting together and roaming about the borderlands between New York and New England, the oblong as it's called. In the late 1740s, one group, a drove of bandit rovers, as Henry Beekman called them, they were unhappy about the lands and they were wreaking great havoc around here. Even a dispute over religious doctrine could prompt 10 men to storm into a church during the service to shut up a preacher they didn't like and get him out of the pulpit. So, long before Prendergast and hundreds of others rose up in 1765, Valley folks were, as one victim of theirs put it, a riotous people. As it turns out, that man calling locals riotous people, by the way, he visited 9 partners. That's where he found all these riotous people, right around here. The man calling locals riotous people was a British officer. For it turns out that the June 1766 firefight was not the first time redcoats found and made trouble in these parts. During the 7 Years' War, in the fall of 1761, a dozen British troops marched into the county on the trail of some deserters and came, according to the locals, belligerently, tying people up, pointing guns at them, threatening to blow their brains out if they didn't hand over those who had gone AWOL. The soldiers, though, pleaded innocent. They said, we're the victims here. We're not the villains. They ended up in jail, by the way, the soldiers. When we asked about the missing men, oh so ever politely, one local answered, I don't know of any, and if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. Not very true. Then this fellow joined with others to beat us up. The soldiers went on, while bellowing among many other traitorous expressions, damn the king! Yikes. Not just the king's troops from far away, but also the king's men in the county, the men who were crown officials, enforcing the king's laws. They routinely suffered this sort of resentment, making it clear that poor Justice Samuel Peters, the man Prendergast ordered dragged through the mud and water and getting his ass kicked, this wasn't the first local official to earn the contempt of common folk. One winter day a few years before that, the magistrate Thomas Davenport rides past the farm of a guy named Benjamin Tidd. Spying Davenport out the window, Tidd's wife says to her husband, why do you not go and take off your hat to your master? I don't know if Benjamin was having a bad day or his wife was nagging him, who knows. Tidd allegedly responded, damn that crook-necked son of a bitch. I'll destroy him off the face of the earth. By God, I'll kill him or burn him up. So the second way I've been holding out on you is how far back in time we have to go to make sense of 1766, of the riots, of the contest between natives and colonists, of the anger of the landlords and their enforcers. Those disturbances were part of a longer, more complicated, more colorful, and I think more interesting story. The third thing I've omitted is that Prendergast's trial in August 1766 and the Wappingers' final hearing in March 1767 is not the end of the story. The Wappingers. A month after that council hearing, Sir William Johnson wrote in his Journal of Indian Affairs that Nimham was back at his house, again demanding that he get his lands back. 5 years later, Johnson again jots in his journal, Nimham was here about lands. At the same time as Nimham was lobbying Johnson, a pamphlet got published in Hartford, Connecticut in 1768, probably written by one of their Connecticut lawyers, we don't know. And a manuscript version of that pamphlet found its way over to Britain. It exists now in Lord Shelburne's papers. Somebody wrote and published this in 1768 in Hartford. Somebody else wrote a manuscript version and sent it directly to Lord Shelburne, the Secretary of State. The guy who wrote the manuscript titled it, and I love the title, A Geographical, Historical Summary or Narrative of the Controversy Between the Wappinger Tribe, and then it goes on for several more lines. And then he looked at that title, and he paused, and he put a little caret on the line, and he wrote above, between the and controversy, he wrote present. So it reads, a geographic, historical summary or narrative of the present controversy between the Wappinger Indians. They were not giving up. So too with the tenant farmers. After Prendergast and dozens of others were convicted, Beverly Robinson wrote to his lawyer, it seems my troubles are not yet at an end, because Moses Northrup, who's an associate of Monroe's and Nimham's, not only refused to surrender his farm to Robinson's man, he also wrote insulting letters taunting Robinson. A man like Moses Northrup does not write to a man like Beverly Robinson, a friend of George Washington's, let's remember, and taunt him. But there it was. And 10 years after that, in February 1776, a mob was back, insisting that we are determined to repossess all the people who had been turned off their places some years past. In other words, those people 10 years ago who got thrown out. They started hauling farmers' furniture out of houses and dumping it in the road and vowing, we will return with greater force to finish the job. Help, wrote one person. If something is not done to prevent them, we shall have a second Prendergast affair in our county. The last, I've been less than fully forthcoming this evening, is in not sketching for you the larger implications of what happened here in 1766. Viewed one way, it all looks like no big deal. Dramatic as they are, the land riots seem but a brief roiling of the waters in the steady current of Hudson Valley history. And of course, the Indians' loss of their homeland is such a sad and common American saga. Talk about unremarkable. But we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss these people or forget these events. In fact, I think it can be argued that both mob men and Wappingers were harbingers of things to come. Let's talk first about the mob men. It's not just that 9 years before Bostonian Paul Revere climbed onto his horse, mob men were riding up and down Dutchess County's highways and byways shouting, I suspect, something like, "The Redcoats are coming! The Redcoats are coming!" It's not just that these rioters, after ousting one tenant family that November 1765 night, said to the guy they put into the farm, "If anybody gives you trouble, send word. We'll be back here in a minute's time." Minutemen! They were here before they were in Lexington and Concord. And it's not just that, like the Minutemen Revere roused, Dutchess farmers said that they planned, when the Redcoats showed up, to line the bushes and fight them, which was exactly the strategy of the Minutemen as the British Army marched back to Boston from Lexington and Concord. They lined the bushes and hid behind the stone walls and picked them off as they made their return to Boston. And it's not just that the farmers hereabouts pledged in their documents, "We will stand by each other with lives and fortunes." Where have we heard that phrase, lives and fortunes, before? It's in the Declaration of Independence. They added lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. Lives and fortunes. The mob men are using it in 1766. These precede the course of human events that would unfold a decade later, a course of events that we will be following here and across the country in the next year or so. But let me go deeper than that on the larger and lasting significance of the mob men. Before British troops occupied Boston in 1768, gunned down townsmen in the state 2 years later in the Boston Massacre, and 5 years after that, marched out of Boston bound for Lexington and Concord. Before then, Hudson Valley folks had a certain disdain for redcoats. They'd seen what the face of tyranny looked like, and they weren't afraid to stand against it. Combine that with a willingness to question, to challenge, to scorn the king's men in their own neighborhood, "You damned rascal, crook-necked son of a bitch." And even the king himself, "Damn the king!" Kings have been brought to by mobs before now. Combine that, and you have the makings of a later America. An America where Benjamin Tidd's profanity-laced refusal to take his hat off to Thomas Davenport would be the norm, not the exception. I'm not going to take my hat off. I'm not going to bow down to anybody. It would become the norm to have that reaction. Benjamin Tidd landed in court for saying that. Later on, people would celebrate men who stood up to those who thought they were better than they were. This is going to be an America where no white man, and I emphasize both the word white and the word man here, no white man would doff his cap to anyone or call anyone master. It's also possibly of larger significance that though they were poor men held in contempt by the likes of Beverly Robinson, though branded a mob, those men in 1764 proved surprisingly adept at drawing up formal articles of agreement with Daniel Nimham, and 2 years later setting up on their own what one of their foes called mob government. Mob government. Think about that for a minute. Mobs are crazed and violent and out of control, and a government usually isn't. To us, it's an oxymoron, but to them it wasn't. These supposedly simple farmers, this supposedly crazed mob, created judges and juries, committees and militia companies, even tax collectors and treasurers. In other words, they discovered that the reins of power in their own hands might function well enough with neither a king nor a land baron literally and figuratively lording it over them. So much for the mob men. What about the Wappingers? Harbingers. Losing their fight, and with it their homeland, though they did not disappear, as so many thought then and since. They nonetheless pointed the way toward a new kind of Indian warrior. acquiring deep knowledge of their conquerors' ways and means, raising money, hiring attorneys, suing people, lobbying legislators, lining up witnesses. Native Americans today use tools and tactics that Daniel Nimham, among others, deployed 250 years ago. Across this land in our own time, America's original inhabitants are still at war, with different weapons and on different battlegrounds, but still at war to defend their homeland and their heritage, thereby testing the old adage about the pen being mightier than the sword. But all of those stories are for another time, later on in my journey into the long ago, if not exactly the far away, for a time when my efforts to recover the doubts and the deeds, all the dreams and the schemes and the hopes and hatreds of these folk is farther along. For now, let me return to that 1743 Henry Beekman letter I began with this evening. The one to those Poughkeepsie men. The one where the land baron lamented that the business is so confused it takes a better head than mine to disentangle a matter. Beekman closed that letter on a more positive and hopeful note. He promised that in doing the research, I shall leave no stone unturned. Neither will I. I have, Beekman continued, unraveled other tangled threads like this one. So have I, over the course of my career, exploring other corners of early America. And I have no doubt, Beekman added, but that I shall get the better of this ball of tangled threads also. Well, I do have some doubt if I'm going to do it. But if I don't get the better of it, it won't be for want of trying. I could write much more, Beekman concluded his letter, but I fear you will tire of reading it. Amen, Henry Beekman. I could say much more, but I fear that you will tire of reading it. Thanks, everybody.
People have questions?
Yes,
I'm just trying to visualize some things, I guess, about the land, and knowing that the Great Nine Partners was laid down in 1697. So this is 1760s, when the tax acts were going on. So I'm thinking that Dutchess County was pretty much at that point broken up into patents.
patents and precincts.
And
Yeah.
precinct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So patents, so they had supposedly worked through treaties with the Indians, but so, I mean, I can understand where there are problems with the treaties and all that, but where's the juncture of like down around Wappinger, southwest Dutchess County, I'm picturing, where, okay, so if it was a patent, I'm not sure exactly which patents are down there, but.
The one in question was what was called the Phillips patent, or the Phillips Highland patent.
Okay.
The Phillips family's main holdings were farther down in Yonkers and below. But this was called their Northern patent or their Highland patent, and it didn't get a lot of attention. That the Phillipses were very anchored in New York City and in the great estate that's still standing there, Phillips Manor. And so they didn't really do much with this Northern patent for a long time. It's pretty rugged territory, hence the name Highlands patent. But it was when Beverly Robinson came in. This was a man who, I think he was the 7th son of a Virginia, distinguished Virginia family, and so he wasn't going to get a lot from his family. That's one of the reasons he came north to New York. He was seeking his fortune, and he wanted to exploit this patent as much as he could. And that's when he really began to crack down on, I want to claim this land, and I want to put people on it, and I want to get them to pay me the rent. So that is when this blew up. Before that, it was kind of an amorphous no man's land. The Wappingers were renting to people. Some people were paying rent to Phillips. But for the most part, it was kind of formless and open to people kind of coming in and hoping that nobody even bothered them.
So the Wappingers had remained on their land basically after a patent may have been
Yeah.
founded,
Yeah.
but like.
They did cede land. There's a great deal of controversy about these treaties. And there's no question that there was a lot of fraud in these treaties and a lot of Europeans taking advantage of a lot of Native Americans. But it's pretty clear too that some of these land agreements were things that natives quite shrewdly wanted to pursue. They wanted a trading post, for example, somewhere closer to them than New York City or Albany. So in about 1680, they worked out with a guy who was an interpreter up in Albany and gave him some land, hoping that he would then set up a trading post. They did grant, in 1691, about a 3-mile swath along the Hudson River, 3 miles east, to 2 men, who then gave it to Adolph Phillips, sold it to Adolph Phillips. Adolph Phillips took that 3 miles and made it, runs all the way to the Connecticut line. Okay? And there was a boundary tree. The map that the Wappingers drew in 1767 showed the tree. By the 1760s, it was a stump. Was it a stump because Adolph Phillips had it cut down? We don't know. There are plenty of trees. You know, when you're marking a boundary tree, one of the things I discovered, they would mark a boundary tree by marking it on all 4 sides, and they'd put the names of all of the guys who had the patent and some of the people who were there, and they'd put blazes on all the sides, and then they'd wonder why 10 years later they'd come and the tree's dead and gone. They're killing these trees in order to mark them. And that tree disappeared. Phillips just pushed, but he claimed it, but he didn't make anything of it. He didn't really do anything. He was a big New York City merchant. He was Speaker of the Assembly. He had lots of things going on down in New York City. So he made this claim, but he didn't really do anything about it until he died in 1749, and then Beverly Robinson came in and said, we can do something with this. And it just so happened that at that time, the Wappingers had left. They had left temporarily, they thought, in order to fulfill their obligations as allies of the British in fighting against the French. Yes?